The canal smelled of mud and fish and morning. May was 36 years old, and she had smelled this canal every morning of her life. The slow, dark water of the Grand Canal running through Suzhou, the city that Marco Polo, 2 centuries before her time, had called so rich and so beautiful that those who visited it were astonished, and which was, in the year 1551 of the Common Era, still all of those things and more. She stood at the water gate of her family's silk workshop, the small stone landing where the canal boats came at dawn to deliver raw silk from the mulberry farms upriver and to collect the finished cloth, and she looked at the water in the early light, the way she looked at it every morning, taking a breath before the day required her full attention. The canal was Suzhou's lifeblood. Suzhou was a city of canals, more canals than streets in some districts, and the canals were the reason Suzhou was what it was. The center of the Chinese silk industry, the city that produced more of the finest woven cloth than anywhere else in the world, the city whose merchants dressed emperors, and whose workshops employed a significant fraction of the urban population in the particular labor of turning the thread from the cocoon of a moth into the fabric that draped the most powerful court on earth. The dynasty was the Ming. The empire was the largest, wealthiest, and most populous political entity on the planet, and May was going to be late if she did not stop looking at the canal and start the morning. Welcome to Dull Tales. Hey there, and good to have you back. Tonight we are going somewhere that most Western history education almost entirely skips, which is a shame, because what was happening here was, by any measure, extraordinary. Tonight we're going to China. Ming Dynasty China, in the middle of the 16th century, the reign of the Zhang emperor, a man who was so deeply committed to Taoist ritual practice that he essentially stopped governing and left the actual running of the largest empire in the world to a series of ministers who ranged from capable to catastrophic. And none of that really matters to the people we're going to spend time with tonight, because what they were doing, what everyone in Suzhou was doing in 1551, was running a city of perhaps 1 million people. A city of silk and canals and merchant wealth and Confucian examination halls and street food and local gods, and the particular daily texture of a civilization that had been running, continuously, for 4,000 years. Stick around, because tonight you'll find out what a Ming Dynasty silk workshop actually looked like from the inside, the noise, the smell, the specific labor of the loom, and why the city of Suzhou in 1551 was probably more economically sophisticated than anywhere in Europe at the same moment. There's a new story here every day, and subscribing is how you keep your place by the fire. No pressure at all. You're here to sleep. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. Because somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. So go ahead and dim the lights, let the blanket settle, and let yourself go. Let's pause for a moment first. Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in a city of 1 million people in the 16th century, when London had perhaps 100,000 and Paris not many more? Have you ever wondered what the Chinese examination system, the most elaborate meritocracy the ancient world ever produced, actually meant for the families of the men who were grinding through it? Have you ever wondered what the world's most sophisticated silk industry looked and sounded and smelled like from inside the workshops where it happened? And have you ever wondered what it felt like to be part of an empire so large and so old that the very idea of something being outside it, beyond the edges, was almost philosophically difficult to imagine? Then come along, because when you close your eyes and open them again, you're no longer here. You've just woken up in the year 1551. The canal is outside the window. The silk is on the loom. And somewhere in the examination hall at the edge of the city, a young man with ink-stained fingers is copying the Confucian classics by lamplight, hoping that this time, the answer will be good enough. Suzhou in 1551 was, in ways that most Western readers are not taught to expect, a modern city. Not modern in the contemporary sense, no electricity, no engines, no steel and glass construction, but modern in the economic sense, the urban sense, the sense in which a city has achieved a complexity and scale and interdependence of function that means it cannot be understood as simply a large village. Suzhou had banks. Not just moneylenders, but institutions that issued credit notes and maintained accounts, and facilitated the long-distance commercial transactions of a silk trade that extended from the farms of Jiangsu province to the shops of Beijing, 1,200 miles to the north. Suzhou had a specialized labor market. The silk industry had divided its production into distinct specializations: the raising of the silkworms, the reeling of the silk from the cocoons, the dyeing, the warping, the weaving itself, the finishing, each of which was a distinct skilled trade, with its own practitioners, its own apprenticeship systems, its own wage rates and dispute mechanisms. Suzhou had a real estate market, with property prices that reflected the same logics of location and scarcity that real estate markets reflect everywhere. The workshops on the good canal frontage cost more than those on the back streets. And Suzhou had a consumer culture. This is perhaps the most surprising thing, from a Western perspective that has been taught to think of commercial consumer culture as something that began in 18th century England and spread from there. Ming Dynasty Suzhou had restaurants, hundreds of them. It had bookshops. It had the shops that sold fashionable clothing, which changed seasonally in a way that historians call a fashion cycle, in the specific sense that what was worn last year was not quite what was worn this year. And the workshops that understood this made money, and the workshops that did not understand it did not. It had entertainment districts where theaters performed opera, the Kunk style that had developed in Suzhou itself, and that was, in 1551, the most fashionable musical theater form in China, and where teahouses provided the social space in which the city's commerce and conversation both happened. Suzhou was a world city. Not in the modern technical sense of the term, but in the sense that matters. A place of such concentrated wealth and culture and human ingenuity that the people who lived in it understood, without arrogance, that they were at the center of things. May had never lived anywhere else. She had never needed to. The silk workshop occupied the ground floor and the courtyard of the family's house. In Suzhou, the distinction between the domestic and the commercial was not the sharp division that it would become in later industrial economies. The workshop was in the house. The house was organized around the workshop. The family lived above the production floor, ate in the rooms that looked out over the loom shed, heard the rhythm of the looms as the background of their daily existence in the same way that a miller's family might hear the millstone or a blacksmith's family the hammer. The looms were large. The draw loom that produced Suzhou's famous patterned silk, the brocade, the figured damask, the silk with its woven patterns of flowers and birds and cloud scrolls, was a machine of considerable sophistication. It was worked by two people: the weaver, who sat at the loom and managed the shuttle, the treadles, the tension, and the draw boy, who sat above the loom on a wooden frame, managing the pattern harness that lifted specific warp threads to create the design. The coordination between the two was precise, learned over years, the kind of silent communication that develops between people who have worked together in close physical proximity for a long time. May's workshop had 4 looms. Each required its 2-person team. 8 workers, plus the apprentices who were learning the draw boy work, plus the auxiliary workers who reeled and wound the silk thread, plus her husband Chen, who managed the commercial side and the customer relationships, plus May herself, who managed everything else. The sound of the workshop at full operation was considerable. The clack of the treadles, the thud of the beater that pressed each weft row into the cloth, the creak of the draw harness, the shuffling and occasional brief exchanges between weaver and draw boy, all of it layered together into the particular industrial rhythm of the silk workshop, which was loud enough to prevent conversation at any distance but regular enough that you stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing a clock. May had stopped hearing it decades ago. It was the sound of the household working. It was, therefore, the sound of everything being all right. The city woke in layers. The canal boats were first. The flat-bottomed vessels that were the trucks of the Ming economy, moving goods through the canal network that connected Suzhou to the larger world, arriving before dawn to make the early market. Then the street vendors, who were the particular institution of Chinese urban mourning that has survived in various forms into the present day. The vendors of hot soy milk and fried dough sticks, the sellers of congee, the peddlers of sesame cakes, moving through the streets on carrying poles with their hot food in insulated containers, calling their specific calls. Then the workshop masters, checking their operations before the workday began. Then everyone else. By the time the sun was fully up, Suzhou was fully in motion. 1,000,000 people going about the particular daily business of living in the most commercially sophisticated city in the world's most commercially sophisticated empire. May's first task of the morning was the inspection. She walked the workshop floor before the workers arrived, checking the state of each loom, the tension of the warp threads, the state of the heddles, the condition of the shuttle and the bobbin supply. A loom in poor adjustment wasted silk. Silk was expensive. The raw silk that came up the canal from the mulberry farms upriver was priced in a market that fluctuated with the harvest, with the condition of the silkworm crop, with the demand from Beijing and from the export merchants who sent silk westward along the trade routes. A family workshop like May's was a price taker in this market, not a price maker. They bought the silk at what the market charged and sold the finished cloth at what the market would pay. And the margin between those prices was where the household lived. Managing that margin required attention to everything: the quality of the raw material, the skill of the weavers, the design choices that determined whether the finished cloth was ordinary or exceptional, and the relationships with the merchants who were the workshop's customers. Chen managed the merchant relationships. May managed the production. This was the division of labor that they had settled into over 17 years of marriage, gradually and without formal negotiation, in the way that working partnerships develop their organization, by discovering, through the pressure of daily necessity, who was good at what. Chen was good with merchants. He had a quality of relaxed confidence in commercial negotiation that May respected and did not share. She found merchants exhausting. Their endless indirect approach to the point, their habit of discussing everything except what they actually wanted until the moment at which they wanted it very badly and needed you to not know that. Chen navigated this with something close to pleasure. May was good with silk. She could assess a batch of raw silk by touch and weight and luster in 30 seconds, and she was rarely wrong about whether it would weave well and whether it would finish well, and whether it was worth what the supplier was asking for it. She could look at a finished piece of brocade from across the workshop floor and identify which loom had woven it, and whether the tension had been correct, and often, who had been at the draw harness. This was not exceptional skill. This was the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had been working with silk since she was old enough to help at the loom, which in May's case was around the age of 6. She was 36 now. That was 30 years of paying attention. It had made her very good at her work. Chen's mother, who was 63 years old and known to everyone in the workshop as Old Lady Chen, had opinions about everything. This was not unusual for a woman of her age and status in Ming China. She was the senior woman of the household, which in the Confucian hierarchy that organized Chinese family life meant that she had authority over the domestic arrangements, over the behavior of the younger women, over the kitchen and the household religious observances, and the planning of the family festivals. She exercised this authority with the practiced confidence of someone who had been waiting for it for 40 years. Her daughter-in-law, May, was competent, hardworking, and good at the silk. Old Lady Chen had acknowledged these qualities to her son when Chen had proposed the marriage, while also noting, and this note was delivered with the particular indirectness that Chinese family communication had developed to manage exactly these situations, that May's family workshop had not the same reputation for finish quality as certain other families that had been under consideration. Chen had married May anyway. 17 years later, old lady Chen regarded this as having worked out adequately, which was the highest praise she applied to anything that she had not personally arranged. May regarded her mother-in-law with the careful respect that the social structure required and the careful management that the daily reality necessitated. It was a working relationship. Most of the important relationships in a Ming household were working relationships. The romantic ideal, the love match, the companionate marriage existed in Ming fiction, quite a lot of Ming fiction, and in the private emotions of actual people, occasionally. But the institutional reality of the household was Confucian, the organized hierarchy of relationships, each with its specific obligations and its specific authorities, the whole system designed to produce stability and social harmony rather than individual fulfillment. You might be unhappy within it. You were supposed to be stable. Often in May's experience, stable and unhappy turned out in practice to be the same thing. She was not unhappy. She was busy. This was, she had decided long ago, the better arrangement. The examination hall stood at the north end of the city, near the Confucian temple, in a complex of low buildings behind high walls. Inside the halls, large rooms divided into rows of small individual cells, each barely large enough for one man to sit and write. The examination system that had governed access to Chinese government for the past several centuries was in operation. The civil service examination was one of the most ambitious institutional innovations in human history. The idea was straightforward, that positions in the imperial government should be awarded not on the basis of birth or connection, but on the basis of demonstrated intellectual achievement, tested through written examination. In practice, the system was more complicated than the idea. The examinations tested mastery of the Confucian classics, the 4 books and the 5 classics, the accumulated texts of the Confucian canon, and skill at composing essays in the highly formalized style called the 8-legged essay, the Baguan, which required a specific structure of 8 sections and a specific rhetorical approach that took years to master. Mastering this required resources, years of full-time study, which meant a family wealthy enough to support a son through a decade or more of education before he produced any income. It required tutors, books, the time and space to study. And it had multiple stages: the county examination, the prefectural examination, the provincial examination, the metropolitan examination in Beijing, and finally the palace examination before the emperor himself. Of the young men who attempted the first stage, a small percentage passed. Of those who passed the first, a smaller percentage passed the second. By the time you reached the palace examination, you were one of a few hundred men out of a population of perhaps 100 million. Wei, who was 23 years old and the nephew of Chen, was sitting in one of those cells. He had been preparing for the provincial examination for 3 years. He had passed the county examination at 18, an achievement that his family had celebrated with a feast that the workshop's account still showed, and had passed the prefectural examination 2 years later. The provincial examination, the Jurin degree, was a different order of difficulty. The cell was small. It contained a wooden board that served as both desk and sleeping platform, a clay inkstone, and the stack of examination paper on which Wei was writing. He had been in the cell for the second of 3 days. He had not slept. The 8-legged essay on the assigned classical text required. The examiner said a passage from the classics, and the candidate had to compose a formal essay interpreting it, was taking shape slowly, painfully, with the specific agony of someone who knows the form exactly but is finding, in this particular cell on this particular night, that the ideas are not coming in the right order. The lamp was low. He had a small reserve of lamp oil that he had been rationing since the first evening. He wrote. He struck out what he had written. He wrote again. Outside the walls of the examination compound, Suzhou continued at its particular pace, indifferent to the sweat of the men inside. This was, Wei had come to understand, one of the essential qualities of the examination, its indifference. The city did not care whether you passed. The classics did not care. The examiners would not know your name until they read the numerical code on your paper. The names were concealed to prevent favoritism. The examination was the closest thing the Ming world had to a system of pure meritocracy. It was also, as Wei was discovering at 2 in the morning on the second day, extremely unpleasant. The street food of Suzhou was one of the city's great pleasures, and one of its great social equalizers. In the morning, the canal-side streets filled with vendors whose specific goods and specific calls were as much a part of the daily texture of the city as the sound of the looms. The Dyehouse vendor, who sold soft silken tofu in warm, sweetened water, the smooth white curd trembling in the bowl as the carrying pole shifted. The Yuxiao seller, with the long, twisted fried dough sticks that emerged golden and hot from the oil and were eaten immediately, torn apart by hand, dipped in the warm soy milk from the vendor at the next corner. The congee cart, with its thin rice porridge flavored with dried fish and pickled vegetables, and the specific savory depth of pork bone broth that had been simmering since before midnight. These vendors served everyone, the workshop master and the workshop apprentice, the examination candidate who had escaped the cell for his authorized morning break, the canal boat worker who had been on the water since 3 in the morning. The street food was not a lesser experience than the restaurant experience. It was its own experience, and in Suzhou, where the cooking tradition was already ancient and already specific, Suzhou cuisine was known throughout China for its sweetness, its subtlety, its particular treatment of the fresh fish and crustaceans of the lake country. Even the street food was good. May ate at the canal-side stall near the water gate, as she ate every morning before the workshop day properly began. The old man who ran the stall had been at the same spot since before May was born, and his wife had run it before him, and his daughter would run it after him. He made one thing, a rice cake, griddled, topped with dried shrimp and scallion, and a spoonful of something fermented and savory that May had been eating for 30 years without ever asking what it was. She ate standing. She watched the canal. A boat was coming in from the south, loaded low with something. She could see the cover tarpaulins but not the cargo. If it was raw silk, it was early in the season for the best quality. If it was cotton, it was going to one of the new workshops that were beginning to produce printed cotton cloth for the lower-end market. The cotton workshops were competition. Not yet serious competition. The brocade market that the family workshop served was not the cotton market, and the merchants who bought brocade for the Beijing trade were not the same merchants who bought printed cotton for the local market. But the cotton trade was growing, and the growth meant that more labor was moving toward it, and more labor moving toward cotton meant upward pressure on the wages of silk workers who knew they had alternatives. Chen had opinions about the cotton workshops. He delivered them at dinner with a regularity that old lady Chen had taken to responding to with the specific silence of a woman who has heard the argument fully stated many times and has come to no conclusion about it. May finished her rice cake. She thanked the old man. She went back through the water gate. The looms would need starting. The dyeing of silk was the work that happened before the weaving, and it happened in a separate part of the workshop in a separate room, because the smell was considerable. The dyes used in Suzhou's silk workshops in 1551 were botanical: madder root for the reds, indigo for the blues, the leaves of the pagoda tree for the yellows, pomegranate rind for a specific warm golden tone, various tannin-rich plants for the browns. The mordanting, the process of treating the silk fiber with a metallic salt that allowed the dye to bond, involved alum, iron, copper, and occasionally tin, each producing a different effect on the final color. The dyer was a specialist. May's workshop employed a dyer named Zhang who was, at 51, at the peak of his skill, and who had opinions about color that were expressed through the work rather than through conversation, because Zhang was a man of very few words and a great deal of practical knowledge. He had learned the trade from his father. His father had learned it from his father. The color formulas for the specific hues that their best customers requested were held in memory, and in a set of small notebooks, written in a shorthand that Lao Zhang had developed himself, and that he had not, as far as Mei knew, shared with anyone. This was not unusual. Trade knowledge in Ming China was closely held, transmitted within families and within workshops, protected by the same logic that protects proprietary knowledge in any competitive market. If your competitors know what you know, you lose the advantage. The problem with this system was that it was fragile. If Lao Zhang died without apprenticing someone fully, if he kept his notebooks too close and his verbal instruction too sparse, the specific color knowledge accumulated over 3 generations would disappear with him. Mei had spoken to him about this twice. Both times he had nodded in the specific way that conveyed acknowledgement without commitment. She had not pressed further. Lao Zhang was the best dyer available to them. The negotiation of how much his knowledge was shared was a long game. She was patient. The silk industry rewarded patience. The Confucian framework that organized Ming Chinese life was not merely a set of rules. It was a cosmology, a complete account of how the universe was structured and what the human place in it was. At its center was the concept of Li, which is sometimes translated as principle or pattern or reason, the underlying order of all things, the structure that made the universe a cosmos rather than chaos. Everything had its Li: the universe, the state, the family, the individual human being. The task of a human life was to align oneself with this order to become, through education and practice and the cultivation of virtue, the kind of person whose actions were naturally correct because they flowed from an understanding of principle. This sounds abstract. In practice, it meant something quite concrete: the 5 relationships: ruler and minister, father and son, husband and wife, elder brother and younger brother, friend and friend. Each relationship had specific obligations on both sides, specific behaviors that expressed proper alignment with the principle of each bond. The father owed the son guidance and provision. The son owed the father obedience and filial piety. The husband owed the wife protection and maintenance. The wife owed the husband compliance and household management. None of these were chosen. They were the given structure of human life, as fixed as the structure of the family house. Wei, sitting in his examination cell in the second night, was writing about these relationships. The assigned text was from the Mencius, the second of the 4 books, and the specific passage was about the relationship between human nature and moral cultivation. Mencius had argued against an earlier tradition that held that human nature was morally neutral, that human nature was fundamentally good, that the capacity for virtue was innate, and that the task of cultivation was to recover and develop what was already there rather than to impose something from outside. The 8-legged essay Wei was writing had to engage with this argument through the formal structure, the breaking open of the topic, the elaboration, the 8-legged body of the argument, the conclusion. His lamp oil ran out at about the 4th hour of the night. He sat in the dark for a moment. Then he used the technique he had learned for exactly this situation. He lay down on the wooden board and composed the next section of the essay in his mind, memorizing it as he went, so that when the pale pre-dawn light began to filter through the high window of the cell he could transcribe it immediately. He had done this before. He would do it again. The examination made its demands, and you found ways to meet them, because the alternative was to be the kind of person who could not meet them, and Wei had not spent 5 years in preparation to discover that he was that kind of person. The Grand Canal was not just Suzhou's lifeblood. It was the circulatory system of the empire. The canal ran from Hangzhou in the south to Beijing in the north, a distance of over 1,000 miles, man-made, or at least man-improved. The original waterways dug and deepened and connected over the course of centuries, and maintained by a significant portion of the imperial bureaucracy whose entire purpose was the management of water. The grain tribute that fed Beijing moved north on this canal. The tax grain collected from the agricultural surplus of the Yangtze Delta, loaded onto tribute barges, pushed and pulled by trackers and sails and the current and the locks, arriving in Beijing weeks after leaving the south. Silk moved north on this canal too, the finished cloth from workshops like May's, going to the imperial court, to the mansions of the Beijing elite, to the provincial capitals along the route. Paper moved north on the canal. Books, porcelain, lacquerware, the entire material culture of the most sophisticated civilization in the world, traveling the 1,000-mile spine of empire. And news moved on the canal, in the informal way that news has always moved along trade routes, the gossip and the commercial intelligence and the occasional genuine political news that the men on the boats carried without official authorization but with considerable reliability. What happened in Suzhou was known in Hangzhou within a week. What happened in Hangzhou was known in Nanjing within another week. What happened in Nanjing was known in Beijing within a month. For the 16th century, this was fast. For the people living in the empire, it meant that they were participants in a shared information space larger than anything that existed elsewhere on Earth. May knew what the silk prices were in Nanjing. She knew, from the canal boat captains who stopped at the workshop water gate, something about the mood of the court, about the faction struggles among the ministers that affected which kinds of luxury goods the palace was currently purchasing, about the foreign merchants from the south who had been appearing at the Guangzhou ports with interest in Chinese silk. These foreign merchants, some from what the Chinese called the southern barbarian countries, the Portuguese who had been showing up at the southern ports since the previous century, were a topic of commercial interest and mild cultural curiosity in Suzhou. They paid well. Their ships were large. Their habits were incomprehensible. They were, in the commercial pragmatism of a Suzhou silk merchant, primarily significant as buyers. What they thought about China, what China thought about them, these were questions for scholars and officials. What mattered in the workshop was whether they wanted brocade or damask, and in what quantity and at what price. The kitchen of the Chen household was old Lady Chen's domain, as it had been her domain for 20 years. She managed it with the systematic attention of someone who understood that the kitchen was the household's central institution, the place from which the family's health flowed, in the Chinese medical framework that understood food as primary medicine, the place where the household's daily rhythm was set, the place where the domestic authority of the senior woman was most directly expressed. The cooking of Suzhou was sweet. This was its defining characteristic among the regional Chinese cuisines, the preference for a gentle sweetness in savory dishes, the use of sugar and shaoxing wine in the braised meats, the careful balance of sweet and savory that gave Suzhou food its particular character. Old Lady Chen made the braised pork belly, the hong shao ru, that was the family's celebration dish, slow-cooked in soy and rock sugar and wine until the fat was melting, and the skin was lacquered, and the smell filled the house with a warmth that was as much psychological as physical. She made it for occasions, the festivals, the birthdays, the successful completion of an examination stage. She would make it when Wei came out of the examination hall, whether he passed or failed. The pork would be the same either way. The mood at the table would be different, but the pork would be there, and eating it together would be the family's acknowledgement of what had been attempted, regardless of the result. She was, in her way, a kind woman. She expressed it primarily through food. This was, in the framework of her world, entirely appropriate. Food was love. Food was health. Food was the household's offering to its members. She stood at the stove in the morning, the smoke from the wood fire rising past her face, and she tasted the morning congee and added a pinch more salt, and this small adjustment was the morning's first act of care. The gardens of Suzhou were the other face of the city. If the canals and the silk workshops were the commercial face, the Suzhou of production and trade, the Suzhou that the merchants knew, the gardens were the cultural face, the Suzhou of the literati class, the scholar officials who had passed the examination, or whose fathers had passed it, and who had retired to Suzhou to grow old in a manner that expressed the Confucian ideal of the cultivated man at peace with his cultivation. Suzhou had more private gardens per capita than any other city in China. This was not an accident. The city's wealth provided the land and the money to build them. The city's literary culture provided the demand. The scholar-gentry who came here wanted to live inside the aesthetic ideal they had been trained to appreciate, and the garden was the physical expression of that ideal. A Chinese garden in the Ming period was not a garden in the Western sense, not a formal arrangement of plants in geometric patterns, not a display of horticultural achievement. It was a constructed landscape, an artificial recreation of the wild mountains and water of the natural world, compressed into the area behind a city wall. Rocks specifically, the fantastically eroded limestone rocks from Lake Tai, which had the quality of looking simultaneously ancient and alive, their surfaces worn by water into forms that suggested mountains, caves, animals, dragons, were the structural element. Water was the structural element. The plants, the pine, the bamboo, the plum, the chrysanthemum, the lotus in the pond, were the symbolic elements, each carrying layers of classical illusion that the educated visitor would read as easily as text. A garden was a poem you could walk through. Or rather, a garden was the material expression of the state of cultivation of the person who made it, and walking through it with the right eyes was a form of reading. Master Zhou, who was 58 years old and who had retired from a position in the provincial administration 12 years earlier, had a garden behind his house, 3 streets from the main canal that was, in May's assessment, excessive. She had been in it once, for a festival gathering to which Chen had been invited as one of the more prosperous workshop masters of the district, and she had spent the afternoon watching the scholar-gentry do their particular version of enjoying themselves, which consisted of composing poems about the rocks and drinking rice wine, and discussing the finer points of calligraphy. She had found it bewildering and a little tedious. She had said none of this. She had sat with the women of the scholar household and drunk tea, and admired the lotus pond, and agreed that the new rock arrangement was indeed very evocative of the mountains of Huangshan. This was the correct behavior. She was good at correct behavior when correct behavior was what the situation required. Master Zhou's garden was, nonetheless, genuinely beautiful. She knew this even through the bewilderment. The way the moongate framed the pavilion. The way the reflected light of the pond moved on the underside of the covered walkway. The specific composition of the large rock group in the south corner, which in certain lights actually did look like a mountain range seen from a great distance, compressed to the scale of a man's height. Someone had thought very carefully about all of this. Someone had spent years, probably, getting it right. She could respect that. The attention required to get something exactly right, she understood that. She applied it to silk every day. The local gods of Suzhou were numerous and specific. China in the Ming period had 3 great religious traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, that coexisted with a vast substrate of local religious practice that the scholars called popular religion, and that the people who practiced it called simply the way things are done. Every neighborhood had its earth god, the Tutigong, the small deity responsible for a specific place. A street, a district, a plot of land whose temple was a small pavilion, sometimes no bigger than a household shrine, where the residents of the area made offerings and asked for help with practical matters. The canal had its water gods. The silk industry had its patron deity, the Lady of Silk, a figure whose origin story varied by region but who was generally understood to have taught human beings the art of silk cultivation, and whose festivals marked the beginning and end of the silkworm rearing season. May made offerings to the Lady of Silk twice a year, at the spring festival when the silkworm eggs were prepared, and at the autumn festival when the year's silk production was assessed. These were not purely religious acts. They were also professional acts, the recognition that the silk crop was uncertain, that the mulberry harvest could fail, that the silkworm disease could wipe out an entire season's production, and that the acknowledgement of forces beyond human control was both spiritually appropriate and practically wise. You could not control the weather. You could not control the silkworm's susceptibility to the pébrine disease that occasionally devastated workshops. You could manage the factors you controlled: the quality of the mulberry, the temperature of the rearing room, the care of the cocoons, with maximum attention. For the rest, the Lady of Silk was there. The Buddhist temple at the north end of the city served the household's larger spiritual needs. Old Lady Chen went to the temple regularly, on the festival days and on the anniversaries of the dead, and she made donations to the monks in the specific amounts that she had calculated to be appropriate to the household's current prosperity, not so much as to be showy, not so little as to be miserly, the correct amount for a household of their standing. This calculation was characteristic. Everything in Ming Confucian social life was calibrated. The gift was calibrated. The ceremony was calibrated. The dress was calibrated. The specific colors and materials and embroidery that marked your social position, the sumptuary regulations that the government periodically issued and that the population periodically ignored, the ongoing negotiation between the official hierarchy of status and the commercial reality that money could buy things that the official hierarchy had not yet approved. The silk workshops of Suzhou were, in a specific historical irony, both subject to these sumptuary regulations and largely responsible for the fact that they couldn't be enforced. The regulations said that certain fabrics and colors were reserved for the imperial family and the highest officials. The workshops made those fabrics. The merchants sold them. The wealthy bought them. The officials periodically reissued the regulations. Life went on. Chen had been in the Teahouse since the 7th hour of the morning. The Teahouse, a 3-story building on the main commercial street near the largest canal, with its ground-floor tea service and its upper-floor private rooms where merchants conducted the more confidential portions of their business, was where the commercial intelligence of Suzhou was traded alongside the tea and the snacks. The tea itself was serious. Suzhou was close enough to the tea-producing regions of Jiangsu and Zhejiang that the quality of the tea available in its tea houses was high, and the culture of tea appreciation that the Scholar-Gentry class had developed over centuries had filtered down into the commercial class, who drank good tea with the same attention that the scholars brought to composing poems about it. Chen was meeting with a merchant named Su, who was a middleman in the Beijing trade, the commercial network that moved Suzhou silk north to the capital, where the palace, the court officials, and the Beijing merchant class were the primary buyers. Su was well-dressed. He was always well-dressed. He was the kind of merchant who understood that in the luxury trade, your personal presentation was a form of advertisement, a signal to potential clients that you dealt in quality, and that the quality of your judgment extended to everything, including your own clothing. He wore a robe of dark blue silk, not, May would have noted from their workshop, because she would have recognized the weave, with a subtle geometric border and jade buttons. Chen wore a robe of gray silk, well-made but understated, which was appropriate for a workshop master who wanted to seem prosperous enough to be reliable without appearing so successful that the merchant would assume there was room to negotiate harder. The clothing was communication. In Suzhou in 1551, everything was communication. They drank tea and discussed the weather. They discussed the state of the canal. They discussed the latest intelligence about the mood of the Beijing market, which Su had received from a colleague who had been in the capital 3 weeks before. The palace was, it appeared, currently interested in a specific kind of embroidered silk for the renovation of one of the inner court chambers. The specification was cloud patterns on a deep red ground, 5-clawed dragon medallions on the upper register, the embroidery in gold thread. 5-clawed dragons were, technically, imperial prerogative, the phoenix embroidery for lesser court officials, the 5-clawed dragon for the emperor and the highest of the highest. Chen filed this away. His workshop did not produce embroidery. But the base fabric for such a commission, the deep red ground, the specific quality of silk that would hold the gold thread embroidery without distorting, That was exactly the kind of commission that his workshop could potentially fulfill if the embroidery house in Beijing required sourcing. The conversation moved, in the indirect way of Chinese commercial negotiation, from the general market conditions to the specific question of what Su might need in the coming season and what Chen's workshop was producing. The prices were not discussed directly. They would be discussed later, after several more meetings, after the relationship had been carefully tended with the small gifts and the demonstrations of mutual reliability that preceded any significant commercial transaction. In the Ming world, business was relationship. You did not do business with a stranger. You did business with someone whose reliability you had assessed over time, whose reputation you had investigated through the network of other merchants who had dealt with them, whose family background and whose examination status and whose past commercial behavior you knew as well as you knew your own. The transaction was the endpoint of a long process of relationship building. The process was the actual business. Chen was good at the process. He had been building the relationship with Su for 3 years. He thought it was almost ready. The weaving floor at midday had a quality that was different from the morning and different from the afternoon. In the morning, the loom started cold and the workers were fresh, and the rhythm built from silence into production. In the afternoon, the rhythm was established and the workers were tired, and the loom sounds had the steady regularity of something that had found its pace and would hold it. At midday, there was a pause. The workers ate their lunch in the courtyard or at the canal side, the loom stilled for an hour, and the workshop existed in a brief quiet that was partly rest and partly the holding of breath before the afternoon session began. May used this hour for the detailed inspection work that required silence and full attention. She examined the cloth from the morning's weaving. She ran her fingers along the finished surface, feeling for the irregularities that the eye might miss. The pulled thread, the slight variation in tension that produced a barely visible line across the weave, the place where the draw boy had miscounted and the pattern had shifted by one repeat before being corrected. Most cloth passed inspection. The best workshop cloth in Suzhou was very good indeed. But the standards for the best customers, the Beijing merchants who were supplying the palace and the great households, were exacting, and a single flaw in a piece of imperial-grade brocade was not merely a commercial problem. It was a social embarrassment, a failure of the household's reputation that would be remembered and discussed in the teahouses and would eventually affect the prices the merchants were willing to pay. The workshop's reputation was the family's most important asset. It was built over generations. It could be damaged in an afternoon. May found one problem in the morning's cloth, a small section near the border of the third piece where the draw boy, an apprentice, one of the younger ones who had not yet fully internalized the count, had produced a repeat that was one thread short. The error was small enough that most buyers would never notice. May noticed. She set the piece aside. She would have a conversation with the apprentice after the lunch break. Not an angry conversation. Not a punishing conversation. A conversation that would make clear, through the specific quality of her attention to the error, that the standard of the workshop was not what most buyers would accept but what the cloth required. The difference between these two standards was the difference between a workshop that survived and a workshop that became exceptional. She had been trying to make their workshop exceptional for 17 years. She was, she thought, getting closer. Wei came out of the examination hall on the morning of the 4th day. The 3-day examination session was over. The papers had been handed in. The cell door had been opened. And Wei stood in the corridor outside the cell block and breathed air that was not the air of the small stone room for the first time in 72 hours, and the air of the corridor, which smelled of stone and other men's sweat, and the lamp oil that had burned in dozens of cells through the night, tasted, by comparison, absolutely extraordinary. He was 23 years old, and he had just written what he believed, in the specific exhausted conviction of someone who has nothing left to reconsider, to be the best examination essays of his life. Whether this was true was not something he would know for several weeks. The examiners would read the papers in the anonymized form, the candidate's name replaced by the numerical code. The examiners would deliberate. The pass list would be posted. This was the part that Wei found, even after years of examination experience, still difficult to inhabit: the waiting. During the preparation there was work. During the examination there was work. Between the examination and the result there was nothing, a space with no traction. He walked out through the examination compound gates into the Suzhou street, and the city received him in the way that cities receive individuals, completely indifferently, with the specific comfort of the impersonal. He bought a bowl of congee from the first street vendor he passed. He ate it sitting on the steps of a small roadside shrine to the neighborhood earth god, the Tudogong, who looked out from his small painted alcove with an expression that managed to be simultaneously serious and faintly amused, which Wei thought was appropriate for a deity who had to watch the examination candidates come and go year after year. He took the bowl back to the vendor. He walked toward the canal. He was going to the family workshop. His aunt would have been told. Someone always knew when the examination session ended. The neighborhood network was too fine for such things to go unnoticed, and his aunt would have either tea or wine ready depending on how she read his face when he arrived, and his grandmother would have been in the kitchen since early morning, which meant the pork belly was already in the pot. He felt, walking toward the canal through the Suzhou morning, something that he could not immediately name. Not happiness exactly, not relief. Something that felt like the resumption of the regular world after the examination had suspended it. The canal was there. The looms were audible from 2 streets away. The rice cake vendor was at his corner, the griddle smoking. The city was going about its business, which was the city's constant implicit lesson about the examination. Whatever happened in the cells, Suzhou continued. This was uncomfortable when you were inside the cells. It was, outside them, a strange relief. The afternoon light in Suzhou had a quality that painters had been trying to capture for centuries. The specific diffusion of the light through the air over a city of water, the canals reflecting and scattering, the humidity of the Jiangnan plain giving the air a softness that the northern light did not have, produced a quality of illumination that was not the harsh, clear light of the northern Chinese cities, but something warmer, more ambiguous, the light that lingered. This light was the background of the landscape paintings that were Suzhou's other great cultural product. The Scholar-Gentry who built the gardens also painted. They painted in the style of the great masters, the master painters of the earlier Song and Yuan dynasties, whose works they studied and copied and interpreted. And the Suzhou painting school, the Wu school, was one of the dominant aesthetic forces in Ming China. The painter Wen Zhengming, who had been born in Suzhou and who was now very old but still alive, was the greatest living painter in the empire. His landscapes were not realistic. They were, in the Chinese aesthetic understanding, more than realistic. They were the expression of the inner nature of the mountains and water, the li, the principle, made visible through the trained and cultivated hand of the artist. May had seen 2 of his paintings in her life, at gatherings in the scholar houses to which the workshop was occasionally invited. She had looked at them for a long time. They showed mountains and water and a small pavilion and a tiny human figure, the proportions establishing immediately what the Chinese landscape tradition had been establishing for 1,000 years. The human being as a small presence in an enormous natural world, at home in it, not dominating it, the correct relationship of the human to the landscape around it. She found this both aesthetically pleasing and, in some private way, reassuring. The world was large. You were a small presence in it. Your job was to do your work with as much care as you could bring to it in the brief time you had to do it. The silk was the work. The loom was the world. This was, she thought, not a bad framework. The river traffic in the afternoon thickened. The large grain tribute barges heading north were the heaviest presences on the canal, vessels 40 or 50 feet long, riding deep in the water under their loads. their crews of 4 or 5 men who had been on the water for days, coming from the collection points in the southern counties, and heading for the transfer station at Qingjiang, where the tribute grain would be reloaded for the next stage of the journey. The tribute system was the fiscal spine of the empire. The grain tax collected from the agricultural surplus of the south fed the capital in the north. Beijing could not grow enough food within reach to feed itself. It needed the south's surplus to survive. The canal was therefore not merely convenient, it was existential. When the canal flooded or silted up, and it needed constant maintenance, the dredging of the silt, the repair of the locks, the management of the water levels that were too high in the rainy season and too low in the drought years, the consequences rippled north all the way to the capital. The Ministry of Works had a dedicated division for the canal. The governors of the canal provinces reported canal conditions to Beijing regularly. In the hierarchy of imperial concerns, the state of the Grand Canal was near the top. May watched the tribute barges pass from the water gate as she waited for the afternoon's silk delivery. They were large and slow and purposeful, and the canal traffic parted around them with the deference that the tribute system commanded, even on the water. The boat she was waiting for was smaller, a private cargo vessel perhaps 25 feet, the family's regular supplier from the silk farm 12 miles upstream. She could see it coming around the canal bend. The boatman, a lean man of perhaps 50 who had been making this run twice a month for 6 years, was at the sweep oar. His wife was at the bow, handling the line. Their son, perhaps 14, was somewhere in the cabin. She raised a hand. He raised a hand. The boat came into the water gate. The negotiation was brief. They had established a price the season before. The quality this season was good. The mulberry harvest had been solid. The silkworms had been healthy. The reeling had been done by the boatman's wife's family, who knew their work. She examined 3 bolts of raw silk. She bought 12. The boatman's wife wrote the transaction in the small notebook she carried. May wrote it in her own notebook. They drank tea at the water gate. This was the relationship, not friendship exactly, but the long, comfortable familiarity of a commercial partnership that had functioned reliably for long enough to become something that resembled trust. In Ming Suzhou, this kind of relationship was one of the basic units of economic life. The medicine of Ming China was a sophisticated system that Western observers of the period consistently underestimated. When the Jesuit missionaries began arriving in China in the later 16th century, just a generation after our story, as part of the same Portuguese maritime expansion that was sending ships to the Guangzhou ports, they found a medical tradition that was, in some respects, more developed than European medicine of the same period, and in other respects working from entirely different premises about how the body functioned. The theoretical foundation was the framework of qi, the vital energy that circulated through the body along specific pathways called meridians, and the concepts of yin and yang, the complementary forces whose balance constituted health and whose imbalance produced disease. The Chinese Materia Medica, the pharmacopoeia of medicinal substances, compiled and expanded over centuries into the enormous Benkao Gangmu that Li Shizhen was, at this very moment in 1551, in the process of compiling, included hundreds of plant substances, animal products, and mineral preparations with carefully documented properties and applications. Acupuncture, the insertion of needles at specific meridian points to regulate the flow of qi, was a highly developed technique practiced by specialist physicians. Herbal medicine was a daily household practice. Old Lady Chen kept a substantial collection of dried herbs in the kitchen, organized in small labeled jars, and she knew their applications with the confidence of decades of use. Ginger for the stomach. Goji berries in the broth for general strength. Chrysanthemum tea for the eyes. The astragalus in the winter soup for immunity. These were not superstitions. They were an accumulated pharmaceutical knowledge that had been tested over thousands of years of use on a population of hundreds of millions, and that modern pharmacological research has confirmed to be, in many cases, genuinely efficacious. May had a recurring problem with her right shoulder, the repetitive strain of years of moving heavy bolts of cloth and assessing the tension of the loom, that the physician she visited had addressed with a combination of acupuncture and a poultice made from a specific combination of herbs that she applied each evening before sleep. The shoulder was better. Not cured, the work continued and the strain continued, but managed. This was, again, the framework. You managed what could be managed. You maintained the capacity to work. The work was the point. Wei arrived at the workshop in the late morning, and May looked at his face and decided on tea first. She could read the examination face by now. Not the face of someone who had failed. That was a specific quality of contained devastation. The face of a person who had put years into something and had received nothing back. Not the face of someone who had certainly succeeded. That was rare, and it was a different kind of brightness. This face was the one in between. The face of someone who had done what they came to do, who had left nothing significant unplaced, who was waiting without certainty for a judgment that was now out of their hands. This face could go either way. Tea was right. Wine would come later with the result. She made the tea herself in the small room off the courtyard where the family sat in the afternoons. She brought it to Wei. He held the cup with both hands in the way he had always held cups of tea since he was a child in this workshop, the way she had first seen him hold a cup at 6 years old when his mother had brought him to visit. He had been a quiet, serious child. He was a quiet, serious young man. The examination had not changed this. If anything, it had concentrated the quality. He was the kind of person, May thought, who would make a good official if he passed. Not the kind who would use the position to enrich himself, though that happened more than the official ideology acknowledged. The kind who would actually try to do the work. This was, she knew from Chen, not as common as it should be. They sat in the courtyard for a while. The looms were audible through the wall. Old Lady Chen, who had heard Wei arrive, appeared from the kitchen long enough to assess his face with the same diagnostic attention her daughter-in-law had applied, register the same conclusion, and return to the kitchen with the specific satisfied nod of someone whose pork belly was already at the correct stage. Wei drank his tea. He asked May how the season's silk had been. She told him. He listened. This was what she liked about him. He asked about the silk and he listened to the answer. The future official understanding the silk, the empire running on the silk, everything connected if you looked. The evening in Suzhou began at the canal. The canal in the evening was different from the canal in the morning. The morning canal was business, the deliveries and the collections and the arrivals and the departures. The evening canal was pleasure, or at least, the portion of the evening canal that was near the entertainment district was pleasure. The tea houses along the eastern canal lit their lanterns as the light failed. The paper lanterns in red and gold and white that turned the water into something reflective and warm. The boats came out, not the commercial boats, but the painted pleasure boats that wealthy families and merchant groups hired for evening entertainments. The flat-bottomed vessels with their wooden pavilion structures and their hanging silk curtains and their musicians. The conch opera that Suzhou had made famous was performed in these boats, in the more elaborate entertainments, or in the large tea houses along the canal, where the audience sat at round tables and drank tea and ate the small delicate pastries that were another of Suzhou's culinary contributions to the world, and watched the singers, and listened to the flute and the pipa lute and the erhu fiddle produce the specific slow sadness that was conch's aesthetic signature. Conch was not fast. Conch was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they refuse to hurry. The arias took their time. The gestures of the performers, the water sleeves flowing from the extended hands, the specific vocabulary of movement that had been codified over centuries into a complete physical language, were designed for appreciation at the pace of extended attention. You could not follow conch while distracted. You had to be present. This was, perhaps, one reason the scholarly class liked it so much. It required the same quality of attention that reading the classics required, the slow, receptive, fully inhabited attention of someone who has been trained to find meaning in careful reading. May was not that evening at the Kuhn performance. She was in the workshop, finishing the audit of the week's production that she did every Friday evening. The count of the cloth produced, the count of the silk consumed, the comparison of the two against the theoretical yield, the identification of any discrepancy that needed investigation. This was not, she was clear with herself, the most romantic way to spend a Friday evening. But the audit was the workshop's health check, and the workshop's health was the family's health, and the family's health was everyone in the household, and everyone in the household was her responsibility in the practical sense that if she did not do this, the information would not exist. And if the information did not exist, the decisions that needed to be made on the basis of it would be made badly. She worked by lamplight. Chen had gone to the evening market. Old Lady Chen was at her Buddhist prayers. Wei was asleep in the guest room, the deep sleep of someone who has not slept properly in 3 days. The apprentices were in their dormitory at the back of the compound. The looms were still. May worked in the quiet workshop, the lamp casting its small circle of yellow light on the account books, the canal sounds faint through the wall, and she found this, the quiet, the lamplit work, the numbers resolving into the picture of the workshop's week, genuinely satisfying in a way she rarely had language for. The numbers were the silk story. She was reading it. The food culture of Suzhou was, by any measure, serious. The Scholar-Gentry who wrote about it the way they wrote about painting and calligraphy, as an art form, as an expression of cultivation, as something that required the same refined attention and historical knowledge as any other form of cultural practice. The Yuan Mei, the great food writer, would be born in a century. His famous cookbook, the Sui Yuan Shiden, would articulate what the Suzhou tradition had been practicing for generations. In 1551, that tradition was already mature. The emphasis was on freshness. Suzhou's lakes and rivers and canals produced an abundance of freshwater fish and crustaceans, the river crab, the mandarin fish, the whitebait, the shrimp. And the Suzhou kitchen's treatment of these creatures was built around the principle of minimal intervention. Fresh ingredients prepared in ways that expressed rather than obscured their essential quality. The braised pork belly that old Lady Chen made was an exception to the minimal intervention principle. It was a slow, deliberate transformation of the ingredient over hours, but even this dish was calibrated to balance, the sweet against the savory, the soft fat against the yielding skin, the deep sauce against the clean white rice that accompanied it. The family ate together in the evening as they ate every evening, the same table, the same positions, the order of service following the hierarchy of the household. Old Lady Chen served first, then Chen, then Mei, then Wei that evening. The pork belly was on the table, the mandarin fish from the morning market steamed with ginger and scallion, the braised tofu with the dark sauce, the simple green vegetable stir-fried in the clear morning, the soup, the rice. They ate in the way of a family that had been eating together for a long time, efficiently, attentively, without excessive ceremony, the food at the center and the conversation, when there was conversation secondary to it. Old Lady Chen asked Wei about the examination essays. Wei summarized them. Old Lady Chen nodded in the specific way that could mean anything from approval to reservation, and no one pressed her to clarify. Chen refilled his wine cup. Mei ate her fish. This was the family at table, the unit of the Ming household functioning in its daily ceremony, the food as the connection, the table as the place where the different threads of the household's day converged and sat together and then separated again. These evenings would end. Wei would pass or fail. Old Lady Chen would die eventually. The workshop would pass to the next generation. The looms would continue. But this evening the pork belly was perfect and Wei was home and the canal was outside and the lamplight was warm on the table. This was what the day had been for. The night in Suzhou was not quiet. Not in the way of a village, where the night settled down over a small population and became genuinely still. A city of 1 million people does not become still at night. It becomes different. The commercial noise ended, the shouting of the vendors, the creak of the canal boats, the industrial sound of the workshops. And other sounds took its place. The tea-house music drifting from the entertainment district, the distant sound of the temple bell at the 9th hour, the cry of the night watchman who patrolled the neighborhood lanes calling the hours, the particular late-night sounds of a canal city that had not entirely come inside, the sound of water on wood, the splash of an oar, the occasional raised voice from a boat that was still moving in the dark. The watchman passed under the window of the workshop. His wooden clapper made its specific rhythm against the silence. Knock, knock, pause, knock, the signal that said, "The 9th hour, all is well, the night continues." May heard it without waking. She had heard it every night of her life. The watchman's clapper was the sound that closed the day and opened the night, the hinge between the day's work and the night's rest, and she received it now the way she received the dawn rooster, as a timing signal, integrated into the architecture of sleep and waking, the daily clock of the city keeping its own time. Chen was asleep. He breathed the slow breathing of someone who had drunk 2 cups of wine at dinner and was entirely at rest. Old Lady Chen was in her room, her rosary beads in her hand. She prayed before sleep every night, the small repetitive prayer that closed the day in the Buddhist way she had practiced since her mother taught her. Wei in the guest room had been asleep since before dinner. He would wake early and eat a great deal and then begin the long process of waiting for the examination results. May lay in the dark and thought about the cloth. This was not, she knew, what most people did when they lay in the dark. Most people, if they thought about work at all, thought about the problems. May thought about the good cloth. The piece of brocade that had come off Loom 3 that morning, the deep blue ground with the peony repeat in gold and ivory, which had come out with a regularity and a luster that was close to the best work the workshop had ever produced. She thought about the specific moment of examining it, running her fingers along the surface, and feeling the weave correct itself under her touch the way something correct does. No catch, no resist, just the smooth confirmation of work done right. She held that feeling in her mind, lying in the dark, the canal outside, the city settling around her. This was the workshop doing what it was supposed to do. This was the family sustained by the silk. This was the thread from the mulberry farm upriver to the loom to the bolt of cloth to the merchant's cart to the noble's house. The long chain of human attention and skill that turned a moth's work into something that lasted, that moved, that clothed the empire. She was part of that chain. She held the middle. This was enough. This was, she thought, in the last moment before sleep took her, more than enough. It was, in the exact words the thought arrived in, before language dissolved into the first images of the dream, everything. The mulberry tree was the beginning of everything. Without the mulberry, no silk. Without silk, no Suzhou. Without Suzhou's silk, no imperial court dressed in the fabric that expressed its power, no Beijing merchant class with its wardrobes of brocade and damask, no export trade down the southern sea routes to the Persian Gulf and beyond. The mulberry farms of the Jiangnan Plain were therefore among the most economically significant agricultural holdings in the world, though they looked, from the outside, like nothing more than rows of trees. The silkworm, Bomix mari, the moth whose cultivation had been China's great secret for millennia, the insect around whose remarkable biology one of the world's great industries had been built, required mulberry leaves and only mulberry leaves. The silkworm itself was a creature of narrow tolerances, specific temperature, specific humidity, specific diet, specific management of the transitions between the stages of its short and productive life. The mulberry farmers who supplied May's workshop had been raising silkworms for 3 generations. They knew what the worm required. They knew the signs of disease before the disease was visible to an untrained eye. They knew the precise moment at which the cocoon was ready for reeling, the moment when the silk fiber could be drawn from the cocoon in a single unbroken thread of extraordinary length and fineness. The reeling itself was a precise operation. The cocoons floated in hot water, which softened the saracen that bound the fiber, and the ends of multiple cocoons were found and drawn together and wound onto a reel, the fibers twisting together into the raw silk thread that would eventually become the warp and weft of the workshop's cloth. All of this happened before the silk reached the canal boat. All of this happened before May touched it at the water gate. The silk that arrived at the workshop already carried inside it the labor of dozens of people across dozens of days. When May assessed a bolt of raw silk at the water gate, the touch, the weight, the luster, she was reading the accumulated work of the farm. She was reading whether the silkworms had been healthy, whether the cocoons had been properly dried, whether the reeling had been even. She was reading, in other words, the quality of other people's attention. Her own attention would add to it. The weaver's attention would add to it. The final cloth, at its best, was the accumulated attention of 20 or 30 people working at the limits of their skill. This is what made Suzhou silk what it was, not the machines. Not the technology, which was sophisticated but not magical. The accumulated human attention, applied at every stage of a process that demanded it. The question of women's work in Ming China is one that the official record obscures. The Confucian framework assigned women to the inner quarters, the domestic space, the household, and men to the outer space, the public world of commerce and government. This was not only an ideological position. It was an organizational structure with real consequences. Women did not sit for the civil service examination. Women did not hold official positions. Women did not conduct business in their own name in many commercial contexts. And yet, the silk industry of Suzhou ran on women's work. The silkworm rearing, which happened in the farmhouses upriver, was women's work in a tradition so old that the mythological founder of silk cultivation, Lady Hsi Ling Shi, the wife of the Yellow Emperor, was a woman. The reeling of the cocoons was women's work. The spinning and the warping were women's work. And in the urban workshops of Suzhou, the weaving itself, the draw-loom weaving that produced the finest brocade, involved women at every level, as drawboy apprentices, as weavers, and as the workshop managers who held the operation together. May held her workshop together. She did this without a title, without an official commercial identity, in the shadow of the structure that assigned public commercial authority to her husband. Chen was the named master of the workshop. Chen was the signatory of the merchant agreements. Chen was the person who represented the workshop in the Teahouse negotiations and the guild meetings. And yet, if you had asked any of the merchants who supplied raw silk to the workshop, or any of the merchants who bought the finished cloth, who actually ran it, they would have described May. They would not have used her name. They would have said, the wife of Master Chen, the woman who knows the silk. She was the woman who knew the silk. This knowledge was not reflected in the official record. It was reflected in the quality of the cloth that left the water gate. Which means it is reflected still in the collections of museums around the world where Ming Dynasty Suzhou brocade is displayed behind glass, the gold thread still catching the light, the pattern repeat still perfect. The women who made it are not named. The cloth is there. The printing of books had transformed Ming China in ways that the people living through the transformation could feel but not fully measure. The woodblock printing technique that China had developed centuries before Gutenberg's movable type had, by the Ming period, produced a book market of considerable size and diversity. Suzhou had bookshops, multiple bookshops, selling novels, the vernacular novel, written in the language people actually spoke rather than the classical literary Chinese of the official texts, was a Ming innovation of enormous cultural significance. The Water Margin, the Romance of the 108 Outlaws, was being read in Suzhou workshops and teahouses and private gardens. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the fictionalized history of the 3rd century civil wars, was being discussed in the same teahouses where the merchants discussed the silk prices. The dream of the Red Chamber was still a century away. But the appetite for fiction, for stories about people living their lives, for the particular pleasure of inhabiting another person's experience through the medium of narrative, was already fully developed. May read. She had been taught to read by her father, who was a man unusual for his class in believing that literate daughters were an asset to a household rather than a complication. She read the vernacular novels in the evenings when the audit was done and the household was quiet, by the same lamplight that she used for the accounts, in the same small room where the tea was kept. She read with the specific pleasure of someone who does not read often enough, intensively, making the book last, returning to certain passages. The novel she was reading at the moment was the story of a merchant's wife in Hangzhou, whose husband was away on extended trade journeys and whose household management was the subject of the narrative. It was, on one level, a story about domestic virtue and household management. On another level, it was about a woman running a complex operation alone for years and doing it well, and the novel's attitude toward this was something that May found in her private reading quietly satisfying. She had said nothing about this to anyone. She kept her reading to herself. This was, in the Suzhou of 1551, the appropriate relationship of a woman to books, private, personal, not discussed. She found it appropriate. Some things are better private. The examination result would come in 3 weeks. The pass list would be posted at the examination compound gates. The name, or rather, the code number, until the names were released after the initial count, would be there or it would not be there. If Wei's name was on the list, he would have passed the provincial examination and achieved the Jurin degree. He would be, from that moment, a member of the official gentry class, in a way that the mere promise of future examination success could not achieve. Doors would open. The family's status would rise. The workshop's reputation, and with it the prices it could command, would benefit from the connection to official prestige. And Wei himself would be eligible for the next stage, the metropolitan examination in Beijing, the final step before the palace examination and the Jinchi degree, the highest qualification, the credential that opened the most senior official positions. Or his name would not be on the list, and he would return to his studies and try again. There were men who had tried 5 times, 7 times. There were men who had spent their entire working lives in the attempt and had never quite passed the provincial examination. The system was designed to produce a small number of officials from a vast population. The vast population of unsuccessful candidates was not a design failure. It was, in an uncomfortable way, the design. A large class of men who had received extensive Confucian education and who had internalized the values of the official culture, even if they had not passed through the final gate. Wei would know in 3 weeks which category he was in. For the next 3 weeks, he would help in the workshop. He was not skilled at the loom. The delicacy required for the drawboy work was something he had never developed, having spent his youth at the writing desk rather than the loom. But he could carry and sort and run the errands that needed running, and he could sit with old Lady Chen in the evening and keep her company in the specific way that the household's youngest male could keep the household's oldest female company, by being present and not doing anything particularly inconvenient. She liked him. She would not say so directly. She showed it by giving him the larger piece of the pork belly. He knew what this meant. He took the pork belly without comment, which was the correct response. The household ran on these exchanges. The household always had. The guild system organized the silk industry in ways that went far beyond simple trade association. In Suzhou's silk districts, the guilds were the governing institutions of the trade. They set the standards for quality, mediated disputes between workshops, negotiated collectively with the merchant intermediaries, maintained the apprenticeship system that transmitted skill across generations, and provided a social safety net for workshop families whose production had been disrupted by illness, flood, or the silkworm disease. The guild meeting happened monthly in the guild hall near the main canal, a building whose architecture signaled permanence and collective authority. The heavy timber beams, the carved gateway, the small shrine to the patron deities of the silk trade. Chen attended. May did not attend. This was the formal division. The guild was a public institution, and the public institutions were for men. But May received Chen's account of the meetings with the attention of someone who understood that the information was professionally significant, and she had, over 17 years, developed a fairly accurate mental model of what the guild meetings actually decided, and what they only appeared to decide. The actual decisions were usually made in the teahouses before and after the formal meeting. The formal meeting was the ratification. This pattern was not unique to the Silk Guild of Suzhou. It was the pattern of Ming civic institutions generally, the formal structure and the informal structure alongside it, and the informal structure being where most of the real work happened. The examination system had its formal structure, the cells, the essays, the anonymous marking, and its informal structure, the family connections, the patronage networks, the teachers whose students did better on average because the teachers knew, in the long-accumulated way of scholars who had both sat the examination and taught students for it, where the examiners were likely to be paying attention this year. Neither structure was dishonest, exactly. They were just parallel. The formal structure provided the legitimacy. The informal structure provided the efficiency. Together they constituted the institution. May understood this. She had been operating in the informal structure of the workshop's commercial world for 17 years. She understood that the informal structure was where she lived, and that this was both a limitation and a kind of freedom. She was not visible in the formal record, and the formal record was not fully in control of the actual outcomes. The cloth was the actual outcome. The cloth was excellent. The rest was arrangement. The silk of Suzhou went everywhere the Ming world reached, and the Ming world reached very far. The tribute system sent silk to the court in Beijing. The commercial trade sent silk to every major Chinese city. The Southern Sea Trade, operating out of the ports of Guangdong, sent Chinese silk to Southeast Asia, to the Persian Gulf ports, and increasingly in this generation, for the first time, to the Portuguese ships that were appearing at Macau and at the Fujian ports, where the silver from the Spanish mines of South America was flowing east in exchange for silk and porcelain. May did not know about the silver or the Spanish mines. She knew, in the canal boat intelligence that reached the Suzhou workshops, that there were foreign merchants paying high prices for certain qualities of silk, and that the prices they were paying were somewhat higher than the Beijing trade prices, and that several of the larger workshop families had begun developing relationships with the export merchants. Whether this was something their workshop should pursue was a question she and Chen had discussed twice, inconclusively. The arguments were, the prices were good, the volume was potentially large, the foreign merchants seemed to want exactly the kind of high-quality brocade they produced. The counter-arguments were, they did not know those markets, they did not have the connections, the export trade involved risks, transit, payment, the uncertainty of foreign commercial custom, that the domestic trade did not, and the domestic trade was working well. The answer they had arrived at twice was, not yet, perhaps not yet. The city was changing around them. The empire was changing around them. The Portuguese ships were the leading edge of something whose shape they could not yet see. In 3 generations, the Jesuit missionaries would be in Beijing, presenting the emperor with clocks and astronomical instruments. In 4 generations, the Ming dynasty itself would fall, replaced by the Qing. In 5 generations, the silk industry of Suzhou would still be running, because the silk industry of Suzhou ran on skill and water and the mulberry tree, and none of those things changed when dynasties did. But in 1551, in the workshop on the Canal, this was all still future. The looms were in the present. The loom was always in the present. The festival calendar was the structure around which the Ming year turned. The spring festival, the Lunar New Year, was the great hinge of the year, the moment when the old year ended and the new one began, when debts were settled and families gathered and the household gods were renewed. The Lantern Festival, 15 days later, was the conclusion of the New Year celebrations. The streets filled with paper lanterns in every color and shape, the canal boats carrying lanterns, the children running with lanterns, the whole city illuminated for a night in the specific festive light that had no other occasion. The Qingming festival in early spring was the time for visiting the family graves, sweeping the tomb mounds, making offerings of food and paper money burned for the dead's use, the annual maintenance of the connection between the living and the ancestors. The Dragon Boat Festival in early summer, the Mid-Autumn Festival in the fall, each with its specific food, its specific activity, its specific set of household and community practices that organized the year into something other than undifferentiated time. May made the mooncakes for the Mid-Autumn Festival herself, every year. Old Lady Chen had taught her the recipe in the first year of the marriage, the specific proportions of the lotus paste filling, the salted egg yolk in the center, the glossy golden crust of the pastry. The recipe had come from Old Lady Chen's mother, who had received it from her mother, and so on backward into a past that nobody had counted. It was not a particularly unusual recipe. Every household in Suzhou made mooncakes. But every household's mooncakes tasted slightly different, the accumulated difference of the small variations in technique and ingredient that each generation had introduced. May's mooncakes were, she was quietly confident, excellent. She did not say this. She made them and served them and noted, from the speed at which Wei reached for the second one, that the quality had been recognized. This was sufficient. The festival calendar was also the workshop calendar. The weeks before the Lunar New Year were the highest demand period. Everyone wanted new cloth for the new year, and the workshops pushed production. The summer months, when the heat in the workshop was most difficult and the silkworm disease was highest risk, were the slowest. The autumn, after the harvest and before the winter, was the second production peak. The workshop year moved to this rhythm, and the family year moved inside the workshop year, and the festival year moved inside both. Everything nested, everything connected. This was, May thought on the evenings when she could think such things, the structure of a life. The loom inside the workshop, inside the family, inside the city, inside the empire, inside the year that turned and carried everything in it. The closing of the workshop gate was the signal that the day had finished. May closed it herself every evening, drawing the heavy wooden bar across the inside of the canal gate and the street gate, the two boundaries of the workshop world. The canal gate was first. The bolt slid into its iron bracket with the familiar sound that meant the water deliveries were done for the day, the external commerce concluded, the household now in its evening form. The street gate was second. The sound of the street, the last vendors, the neighbors returning, the watchman's preliminary rounds, was present until she closed it, and then it was background, present but at a remove, the city continuing beyond the walls of the household's contained world. The gates marked the transition. Inside the gates, the workshop, the family, the domestic life. Outside the gates, the canal, the city, the empire, the world. This division between inner and outer was one of the fundamental organizing structures of Chinese life. It was architectural, the walls of the compound, the gates, the nested sequence of inner and outer spaces that Chinese domestic architecture built as a matter of course. It was social, the Confucian distinction between the inner domain of women and the household, and the outer domain of men and public life. It was cosmological, the inner and the outer as two aspects of a single order, each requiring the other. May moved between the inner and the outer in the ways available to her. She managed the inner completely. She shaped the outer through the quality of what came out through the gate. The brocade went out through the gate on the merchant's boat. The reputation went out through the gate in the merchant's assessment. The families standing in the city went out through the gate in the cloth. She never went to Beijing. She never went beyond the range of the canal boats that she knew by name. She did not need to. What she made went everywhere she did not go. This was the reach of the workshop, not her body in space but her work in the world. It was considerable. The Suzhou that May lived in is still there in some sense. The canal system survives, though reduced. The classical gardens that the Scholar-Gentry built have been preserved. The humble administrator's garden, the lingering garden, the garden of the master of nets. and are now among the most visited cultural sites in China, UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the physical survivors of the aesthetic world that the 16th century scholars created. The silk industry, transformed by industrialization but not eliminated, still operates in Suzhou. There are still workshops. There are still people who know the silk. The old town, Pingjiang Road, still has canals and old buildings and the remnant architecture of the city that May would recognize in its proportions if not in every detail. And in the museums of the world, the Victoria and Albert in London, the Metropolitan in New York, the Palace Museum in Beijing, there is Ming Dynasty Suzhou brocade. The gold thread still catches the light. The pattern repeat is still perfect. The weave is still tight. The women who made it are not named, but you can feel their hands in the cloth, the specific quality of attention that makes a thing last. 2.5 centuries after its making, the silk is still silk. The mulberry tree, the silkworm, the cocoon, the thread, the loom, the hands. The chain of attention still holds. The examination system was not simply a method for selecting officials. It was the central myth of Ming society, the story the society told itself about what it was and how it worked. The myth was this, that any man, regardless of birth, could study the texts, master their meaning, demonstrate his mastery in the examination hall, and rise to positions of authority and honor. Birth mattered, but not absolutely. Wealth helped, but it was not sufficient. What mattered was learning, which is to say, in the Confucian frame, what mattered was virtue manifested through intellectual discipline. This was a powerful myth. It was not entirely false. Men of modest origins had risen through the examination to positions of enormous influence. The Chancellor Zhang, whose long shadow fell across the reign of the Wanli Emperor a generation after Wei sat his provincial examination, came from a family that was not aristocratic, not wealthy by the standards of the Scholar-Gentry, but had invested everything in a single son's education. Zhang had passed, had risen, had shaped the empire. This was the myth's proof of concept, but the myth obscured as much as it revealed. The examination system required years of full-time study. Years during which a young man produced nothing, contributed nothing to the household economy, consumed resources that a poor family could rarely afford to spare. The son of a laborer or a small farmer might be bright enough. He might even be brilliant. But brilliant was not sufficient without time, and time required money, and money required the family to survive without the son's labor, which required a surplus that most families did not have. The examination system was, in practice, a system for the sons of families that could afford to educate them, which meant, in practice, the families that already had some resources, which meant the system reproduced with each generation the advantages of the families that had already succeeded in previous generations. This was not entirely the point, but it was the effect, and anyone who looked honestly at the composition of the examination halls, who sat there, where they came from, what their fathers had done, would have noticed that the myth of pure meritocracy was somewhat more complicated than its telling. Wei knew this. He had thought about it in the way that people think about systems they are simultaneously inside and dependent upon, with a mixture of clear-eyed analysis and the need to believe that the system was legitimate, because if it was not legitimate, then his own years of effort were not a preparation for merit but a ticket in a lottery that favored the already lucky. He did not resolve this. He continued to study. He would continue to study until the result came, and then the result would resolve it one way or the other. Lao Zhang, the master dyer, had an opinion about the examination system. He shared it rarely, because it was not the kind of opinion one shared with people who had sons sitting examinations. His opinion was that the only knowledge worth having was knowledge you could use with your hands. A scholar who knew the complete texts of the 4 books and 5 classics could not, if his life depended on it, produce a length of silk that would sell at the morning market. He could not assess the quality of raw fiber. He could not read the color of a vat. He could not feel the weight and drape of finished cloth and know whether it had been properly degummed. He could not do, in short, any of the things that Lao Zhang had spent 50 years learning to do. And yet, Lao Zhang would never have a title, would never serve at court, would never have his name inscribed in the records of the prefecture. He would die a craftsman, his knowledge would die with him unless he found an apprentice worthy of it, and the examination system would continue selecting men who knew Confucius but could not identify a properly mordanted fiber. This seemed to Lao Zhang a peculiar way to run an empire. He kept this opinion mostly to himself. He shared it occasionally with the vat standing over his best indigo solution in the afternoon light, watching the color develop on a test skein of raw silk, muttering his critique of the meritocracy to an audience that did not argue back. The vat, at least, was honest. It responded to what you actually did, not to what you could write about it. Put good work in, get good color out. He had never seen a vat pass an incompetent because his essay structure was correct. The children of the workshop neighborhood knew Lao Zhang as the man with the blue hands. His forearms were permanently stained. Years of working with indigo had left their mark on his skin in the same way that years of wielding a brush left their mark on a calligrapher's right hand, or years of carrying heavy loads left their mark on a porter's shoulders. The body remembered its work. The children were not afraid of him. He was, in the way of craftsmen who have spent decades being patient with difficult materials, more patient with children than most adults. He had no children of his own. His wife had died 12 years ago. He lived in the small house attached to his Dyehouse, ate simply, worked consistently, and spent his evenings reading not the examination texts, but the practical manuals that recorded the craft knowledge of the trade. There were books on dyeing, not many. Most knowledge traveled by demonstration rather than text, a master showing an apprentice, the apprentice's hands learning before his mind fully understood, the body acquiring the knowledge that the texts could not fully capture. But there were books, and Lao Zhang had read them all, annotated them, argued with them in the margins. He had written, in a small notebook he kept for his own use, his own observations about particular dyestuffs and particular fabrics under particular conditions. This notebook was not a formal text. It was not something he intended to publish. It was his conversation with the craft, the accumulated record of 50 years of paying attention. He was 51. If he was lucky, he had another 15 or 20 years of working life. Then the knowledge in the notebook would be whatever it was, and the craft would continue without him, and someone else would have to learn again from the beginning the things he had spent a lifetime discovering. This was the condition of craft knowledge. It was always being lost and relearned. No generation could pass on everything. Some things inevitably went with the person who knew them. Lao Zhang found this melancholy. He also found it, in some way he could not entirely explain right. The knowledge had to be earned. It could not simply be handed over. If it could be handed over without the earning, it was not quite the same knowledge. The knowledge he had was inseparable from the years of its acquisition. Give someone the notebook without the years and you gave them something, but not the same thing. He was not sure how to explain this. He went back to his vat. The indigo was ready. The water in the canals moved at different speeds depending on the season and the rain. In summer, after the plum rains that flooded the lowlands north of the city, the canals ran fast and brown, carrying silt from the fields upstream. In autumn, the water cleared. The canal below the workshop gate ran a green-gray in autumn, the color of old celadon glazed with shadow. Boats moved on it all year. The canal was not a feature of the city. It was the city's circulatory system, the medium through which the city breathed. Goods arrived by canal, raw materials arrived by canal, the finished silk left by canal. The food that fed the weavers and the dyers and the merchants and the scholars and the examination candidates arrived by canal, from the rice paddies of the countryside, from the vegetable gardens maintained outside the city walls, from the fishing grounds of Teahouse Lake 15 miles to the west. Suzhou was a canal city. Remove the canals and you removed the reason for Suzhou's existence. The city would not have been where it was, would not have grown to the size it was, would not have been capable of the commerce it sustained without the water. The water was the city's reason. This was true of many of the great cities of the Yangtze Delta, the region the Chinese called Jiangnan, the land south of the river. Hangzhou, which had been the imperial capital of the southern Song dynasty 3 centuries earlier, was built on a lake and threaded with canals. Wuxi, Changzhou, Nanjing, all canal cities, all water cities, all dependent on the same fundamental infrastructure that the ancestors of their inhabitants had built over centuries of patient engineering. The Grand Canal, the Dyehouse, was the spine of this system, connecting the Yangtze Delta to Beijing 2,000 miles to the north. It was the longest artificial waterway in the world. It had been built and rebuilt over 1,000 years, each dynasty adding sections, deepening channels, constructing the locks and sluices that allowed boats to move between water levels. The grain that fed Beijing arrived on the Grand Canal. The silk that clothed the court arrived on the Grand Canal. The taxes of the southern provinces, the richest provinces, the ones that generated most of the empire's revenue, moved north on the Grand Canal. The empire's fiscal life depended on it as completely as the empire's commercial life. When the canal silted up, or when floods damaged its banks, the effects were felt in Beijing within months. The Jiajing emperor, reigning now in his 45th year on the Jiajing throne, understood this dependency. He understood it the way a man understands the vein in his wrist, not because he had studied it, but because he felt it when it worked and would feel it very differently if it did not. The bureaucracy maintained the canal. The maintenance of the canal was a permanent item in the empire's budget, a permanent concern of the Board of Works, a permanent source of employment for the corvée labor drafted from the counties through which the canal passed. The canal was never finished. It was always being worked on. It was infrastructure in the truest sense, not a thing but a process, not a structure but a practice, not built once but maintained forever. May had never been to Beijing. She had never seen the northern end of the Grand Canal. But every bolt of silk that left through her workshop gate eventually reached that canal, joined its traffic, moved north through the locks and the straight cuts and the slow bends of the world's longest man-made river, and arrived, eventually, at the northern terminus, and from there by land to the capital, and from the capital to wherever silk went from there. She was, in this sense, connected to everything. The canal connected her. The canal connected Suzhou to the empire. The empire was, in a very real sense, the canal. The night before Wei would leave for the examination hall, May made him a bowl of the soup he had always liked since childhood. It was a simple soup, pork broth, winter melon, a handful of dried shrimp, ginger. Old Lady Chen had made it for him when he was small and sick with fever. It was the taste of being cared for, the taste of the household at its most domestic. He ate it in the kitchen, sitting at the low table where family meals happened, not at the formal dining table where guests were received. This was intentional. The kitchen was the center of the house. It was Old Lady Chen's domain, and entering it was entering a space of warmth and unceremonious attention. Wei ate the soup slowly. He did not speak much. There was nothing left to say about the examination that had not been said over the preceding weeks. He had studied everything he could study. He had written practice essays until his brushwork was automatic. He had memorized passages he had forgotten and forgotten passages he had memorized and memorized them again. The preparation was complete. What remained was the performance, and the performance was tomorrow, and talking about it tonight would not improve it. Old Lady Chen refilled his bowl without being asked. May sat at the table and did not read the accounts. The accounts could wait. This was the kind of evening that did not announce its significance. It was just a family eating soup in a kitchen on a Tuesday night in autumn, but it would be one of the evenings that Wei remembered later, however things turned out. The soup, the kitchen lamp, his aunt setting down the account book and just sitting. His grandmother's hands, moving with the quiet competence of someone who has fed people for 60 years. The canal outside, doing what it always did. The city doing what it always did. The examination waiting in the morning like a door that would swing one way or the other, and nothing to do now but eat the soup. He ate the soup. The silk trade had a geography that most people who wore silk never thought about. They felt the cloth against their skin. They saw the sheen of it in lamplight. They paid the price for it and wore it, and eventually it wore out and they bought more. The geography behind the cloth, the mulberry trees, the silkworms, the cocoons, the rivers of the Yangtze Delta, the workshops of Suzhou, the canal boats heading north was invisible to them. This invisibility was how supply chains worked. The finished product concealed its own making. The cloth arrived as cloth, not as the accumulated labor of the mulberry farmers and the silkworm tenders and the cocoon reelers and the thread twisters and the draw boys and the weavers and the dyers and the finishers and the merchants and the boat workers who had moved it from the workshop to the court. All of that disappeared into the fabric. What remained was the silk. What remained was beautiful. In the Forbidden City, in the throne room where the emperor received his ministers, the wall hangings were Suzhou silk. The emperor did not think about Suzhou. He sat in his inner chambers, attended by eunuchs, reading the memorials that his officials had drafted and his secretaries had summarized, and somewhere in the documents was a reference to the silk tribute from the Jiangnan region, the bolt count and the quality assessment, and the minor official problems that the regional bureaucracy had resolved or failed to resolve. The emperor read past it. It was routine. The silk came. The silk always came. In the workshop on the canal, May would not have known that the emperor had read past it. She would not have expected to know. The emperor was as remote as the sky. The sky was what the sky was. The work was what the work was. The loom was what the loom was. The next commission was waiting. You are in your bed. The canal is quiet outside the gate. The looms are still. May has closed the workshop for the night. Wei is asleep in the guest room, waiting for a result that is still 3 weeks away. Old Lady Chen's prayers are finished. The lamp is out in the accounting room. The bolt is across the gate. And somewhere up the canal, a boat is moving in the dark, carrying tomorrow's silk toward the city. Sleep well. And that, for tonight, is Suzhou, the city of silk and canals and the examination that ground young men to powder, and the workshops run by women whose names were not recorded, and the cloth that went to every corner of the world and lasted and lasts still. Thank you for being here tonight. There is a new story here every day. Subscribe and keep your place by the fire. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every one. Good night.